Hello and welcome back to the second video in a series on how to work with Rahu and Ketu in a horoscope. If you remember the last class, we were talking about how important it is to understand the dignity of Rahu or Ketu's dispositor if you want to do good work with Rahu and Ketu. If you want to know the difficulty of Rahu Dasha or the difficulty of Ketu Dasha or even the ease of either of those. Now generally Rahu and Ketu Dashas are going to bring challenges regardless, but when the dignity of the Lords is not really very good, then the difficulty of that dasha can be much more intensified, with other factors included. Over the course of these videos, we're going to get into what some of those other factors are. I just thought I would mention that this is a technique that I have learned from Ernst Wilhelm, and I know on his video site he has loads and loads of videos of Rahu and Ketu, and this is a very profound way of working with Rahu and Ketu. And then when you begin to integrate the nakshatras, which are really my passion, and with it you get into a lot of really interesting things over the course of these videos. We are going to get into that. But let's kind of get back to talking about Rahu and Ketu through their dispositors and how it tends to work. We're going to cover some points here. First of all, this is just a randomly created chart. Sometimes when I'm giving an example, I like to do that because it's something or someone that we don't really know. So we have to kind of think a little bit more deeply. We can't really go and, as it is with quote-unquote famous people, we can't really judge their lives because we don't really know anything about their lives. This is just a randomly created chart. So if you remember last week, we were talking about the dignity of Rahu and Ketu's Lord by using temporal dignity. And if the dignity of that Lord is not doing well, and I know I already just said this earlier, then I want to really kind of drive the point home. Then if the dignity is not doing very well, then Rahu or Ketu, dependent on who has their Lord in bad dignity, there's going to be some problems with that particular dasha. We also need to keep in mind, and over the course of these videos also, I will get more into the Varga charts, but the point I'm trying to make is that in the Varga charts as well, in each individual Varga chart, Rahu and Ketu can have different dignity. And that's why it is so up and down, and so I think I want to use the word multifarious, and so many diverse things going on during Rahu and Ketu's dasha periods. They can be really challenging and sometimes even a little bit overwhelming. So it's important to understand that. It's also important to keep in mind that the house cusps, or houses that Rahu or Ketu happen to be in the Rashi chart, they're going to carry that agenda into every single Varga chart. And additionally, they'll incorporate the dignity, they'll incorporate their agenda in that particular Varga chart that they're in as well, by placement from the Ascendant. If they happen to be in the Antardasha period of their Lord, they'll activate the position that they are from the Ascendant in the Varga chart as well. But that's another matter. We'll get to that in a little bit of a later video. For now, let's just stick with the dispositors, and let's do this step by step and really see if we can begin to learn some techniques so we can really understand Rahu and Ketu dashas, which are some of the most difficult dashas for an astrologer to understand. And I can never seem to resist the temptation, because I want to mention another point too, which is what makes them so difficult to understand. You also have to consider the fact that Rahu and Ketu have planets aspecting them, and they're going to take all of the energy of the planets that are aspecting them, and most importantly, the energy of their dispositor. And especially with Rahu, Rahu's going to focus all of that energy onto the external stage of an individual's life, so they work out what's going on inside of themselves. Work out their dark spots, because really what happens with Rahu is Rahu is going to take you into your vulnerabilities. That's the word I want to use. It's going to make you confront your dark sides. Now, I don't mean, dark as in evil. I mean those parts of yourself that you don't pay any attention to. It's going to project them onto the stage of your life so that you have to pay attention to them, so that you no longer have a weak foundation in those areas, but instead you have a strong foundation. Now, Ketu represents that strong foundation. It represents what you have done before. But with Ketu, unless there are specific factors, which we'll probably get to this in one of the next few videos, with Ketu, it's more of the thing of not having evolved past whatever Ketu represents. Ketu can have a strong foundation, but it doesn't always provide further growth unless Rahu is developing that further growth. And that's why the two nodes really meet each other, right? So perhaps I digress, but it's important to get into all these topics as we go along and as they come to the surface. Let's talk tonight, and we'll give an example, and we'll go through the steps that we've learned so far, and we'll add some of the new steps. But let's talk about the placement of the lords of Ketu and Rahu from the Ascendant in the Rashi chart, and equally from Ketu and Rahu themselves, and what that is going to mean. Now, first of all, wherever Ketu's lord is placed, that's going to indicate the area that the native who has that particular placement has been developing and establishing whatever Ketu is connecting with in the Rashi chart. So to give you an example, and we'll go into analyzing this here in a moment, but just to speak the simple technical example first. Here we have Ketu in the 11th, right? So an 11th house agenda with Ketu. And we've got Mercury in the 2nd from the Ascendant. Okay, so basically Ketu in a previous lifetime, the individual would have been working with an 11th house agenda through 2nd house things, okay? Equally as well, we need to look at the fact that Mercury is in the 4th position from Ketu. So security, stability, happiness, things along those lines. But we'll do the analysis bit here in a moment. Okay, but I'm just trying to give you an idea. So remember, wherever Ketu's lord is placed indicates the area that the individual is working out Ketu's natal placement in the chart. So Ketu in Gemini in the 11th would be worked out by 2nd house matters, or even 4th house matters. We'll go a little more into depth with that. So where you have Rahu, that's where the individual is going to further develop and deal with developing past that previous karma, right? So for instance, Rahu here is in Sagittarius, right? And we're looking at 5th house, a 5th house agenda. So basically, because Jupiter is in the 6th here, that's going to be worked out through 6th house factors, okay? Equally, it's the 2nd from Rahu, so it's going to also involve 2nd house factors. So let's look at some analysis of this here in a moment, but let's kind of go over a few factors. When the lords are in angles, that's going to indicate more focused development of Ketu or Rahu, dependent upon which one we're talking about. In other words, when the individual is in Ketu Dasha or Rahu Dasha, it's going to be very focused process or development of whichever node is active. It's going to happen on the more external stage of the individual's life. I mean, well, everything happens on the external stage, but when we're looking at the angles, the 1st, the 4th, the 7th, and the 10th, those are more the, the really important things in life. We look at the 1st house, that's self. 4th house is happiness on many levels. It's also fortune, right? 7th is relationships. 10th can be career, amongst other things. It's also the active resolution, the active the activity that one puts towards one's karma, right? That's the phrase I want to use. So when you've got a 1st, 4th, 7th, or 10th agenda, it's very focused development. When it's the 4th and the 10th, it's going to be pretty balanced. When the Lord, and I'm talking about the Lords here, when the Lords of Ketu or Rahu are in the 4th or the 10th, it's going to be pretty balanced development and very focused. When those Lords are in the 1st or the 7th, it ends up being one to the exclusion of the other, right? So if we're looking at the Lord in the 1st house, meaning in the ascendant, so to speak, then the focus is going to be resolved mainly through self, right? You see what I mean? To the exclusion of others. If that Lord is in the 7th, then it's going to, the development will happen through others in one's life, to the exclusion of oneself. That's the point I'm trying to make. When the Lords are in the 5th or the 9th, then that's going to indicate more effortless development. It doesn't mean that life is going to be a piece of cake or a bowl of cherries and everything's going to be hunky-dory. It just means that Ketu and Rahu are going to, it's going to flow. It's going to happen. It's going to move quickly and with a natural flow. In other words, the individual will just see these things naturally happen. They may even have more of an opportunity to surrender to the flow of Rahu or Ketu, whichever one is in, has its Lord placed in a trine. It's when you get into the concept of the dispositor or the Lords being in the 6th, the 8th, or the 12th that you begin to get into the depths of stress, difficulty, and a lot of very deep challenges, right? When the Lord of Ketu or Rahu is in the 6th from the ascendant or the 6th from Ketu or Rahu, then there can be a lot of stress in resolving Ketu or Rahu. There can be a lot of conflict, obstacles, delays, problems even with one's health in the working out of Rahu or Ketu, okay? When you've got the Lord of Rahu or Ketu in the 8th, that's even more challenging. And what it begins to bring is unexpected changes, upheavals, things, just getting really difficult and really challenging, taking the individual into their vulnerabilities, right? Why does that happen? Well, if we understand that the 8th house really on one level is about bringing us to the space where we're able to understand our karma so that we actually take the actions to pay off our karmic debt, then we can understand that many times we have to go more deeply into that vulnerability. And what better way for an individual to go into that than to have no choice but to do so through upheaval and difficulties like that. It's a very difficult placement, but when an individual does Rahu or Ketu like that, it brings very profound growth, and even after that particular dasha, very solid strength because of the challenges that they have gone through. When you're dealing with the 12th, Rahu or Ketu in the 12th house itself, I should say the dispositor of Rahu or Ketu, sorry, confused there. The dispositor of Rahu or Ketu in the 12th from the ascendant, or in the 12th from Rahu or Ketu, then there can be a lot of loss in resolution of Rahu or Ketu, a lot of expense, things just never really going well, losing friends, losing money, just losing things in general, right? It tends to happen. A person suffers a lot of loss when they have the Lord of Rahu or Ketu placed in the 12th. Now, if those planets, those lords are in bad dignity, it's going to be even worse. So let's say that the lords are in bad dignity, and we're dealing with the 6th, the 8th, or the 12th as one of those houses. Well, then that stress is going to be worse. That upheaval is going to be worse. That loss is going to be experienced as being even worse, right? when that Lord is in the 5th or the 9th, so things can flow more effortlessly, the individual may not have the capacity to understand really what's going on, whereas if that Lord was in decent dignity in the 5th and the 9th, it would flow more effortlessly, and the individual would really be able to integrate the lessons of Rahu and Ketu well. So again, if that Lord is in ill dignity, they would probably have a lot of difficulty integrating those lessons, even though things were flowing rather smoothly and rather quickly for them due to the position of the 5th and the 9th. If you've got the Lord in an angle and it's bad dignity, well, those important areas of one's life, there can be a lot of really difficult things going on, but you have no choice but to face them because it's happening in your relationships, or it's happening with your fortune, or it's happening with yourself, or it's happening with your career. So you have to take a look at it, right? So just giving you some ideas of how that works. And we're going to do an example here in a moment as well. When you've got the Lord in the 3rd or the 11th, well, with the 3rd, that means that whatever the agenda of Rahu or Ketu is, it's going to take a lot of effort to really work with Rahu or Ketu. When that Lord is in the 11th, either from Rahu or Ketu or from the Ascendant, it'll take a lot of planning to deal with whatever the agenda of Rahu and Ketu are. And that's, again, either from the Ascendant or from Rahu or Ketu themselves. It's always a good idea to look at both of those. When that Lord is in the 2nd house, it means a lot of responsibility in dealing with Rahu or Ketu. So again, looking at the dignity of those Lords. If it's in the 3rd or the 11th and it's in bad dignity, a lot of planning and things aren't working out well. If it's in the 3rd, the person's putting out a lot of effort and things are not working out well, and it's just not coming out as planned. But eventually with the 3rd and the 11th, because they're what are called upachaya houses, things get better over time, right? It's the same with the 6th. Delays, but things get better over time. With the 2nd, it can feel like a lot of responsibility, a lot of burden for the person to shoulder. If that Lord is in bad dignity, it's going to be a very hard burden to shoulder. If that Lord is in good dignity, well, it's something that they're willing to shoulder, and it's, even though they feel the burden, it's not quite as bad. Okay? So let's take an example, and let's do this step by step. We're just going to do one example tonight, because again, I want to keep these videos short. Maybe the next video we'll just do a couple of examples and begin to work with these a little more deeply before we introduce some more factors. Okay? So Ketu in the 11th. Let's take this step by step. We're not going to get into nakshatras yet, unless I can't resist the temptation, and then we'll do so anyway. Okay, which may actually happen in this case because we've got Ketu and Ardra and Rahu and Mula. So they're in each other's nakshatras. So my curiosity may get the better of me. Okay, so when you have Ketu in Gemini, right? Ketu in Gemini can create a past life where an individual really structures their life based upon how they think things work. It's based upon intellectualism. I have this thought that things work like this, and I've had it confirmed to me that things work like this, right? When you have Ketu in conjuncting the 11th, as we have here, just one possible interpretation. Well, when Ketu is conjuncting the 11th, that thought process that one has built one's beliefs around gets confirmed by one's peers, right? One finds a group of like-minded individuals that really confirm that. Another way of looking at this is when you've got a Ketu conjunction with the 11th. In the previous lifetime, the individual was able to follow their ideals, really build a life based upon what they really thought or what they were really inspired by. Right, and they had this intellectual philosophy that they can do that. That if you that if you believe in something and you have this ideal, if you work hard towards it and follow your inspiration, then it will bring you what you're looking for in life. And it likely gets confirmed through the individual's peers, right? So then when we have Rahu in the 5th, what ends up happening is that those groups of like-minded individuals that one used to feel comfortable associating with in the past, they no longer bring the satisfaction, right? So there's no security by, going along with the crowd. Instead, one has to follow whatever one feels naturally inspired towards. With Rahu in Sagittarius, rather than being able to fall back on that structured way of thinking, instead, things get introduced into the individual's life that bring things to them that they have absolutely no explanation for. And so they're forced to kind of develop a new philosophy or a new way of looking at things that incorporates a philosophy for all those things they don't have a philosophy for. And that is usually built up around the concept of faith, right? Of having faith in things, having faith in things that the individual is taught. But that's difficult for the individual because they don't find satisfaction in peers, right? And because they have Ketu in Gemini, if somebody teaches them something, they're likely to believe it for a while, but then that way of looking at it begins to fall through later on because they don't know if they can have faith in that. They don't really know if that's something that they can trust or something that holds validity or holds water for them, which is as it should be because they're having to focus on what inspires them the most. Okay, so there we have an idea of the foundation, right? Equally, we can look at the fact that Ketu is here with Saturn. When there's a Ketu-Saturn connection, usually in a previous lifetime, the individual was an authority in some type of field. So this time around, and that makes sense when we have this Ketu-Gemini connection. So the person thinks things work this way, and they're seen as an authority on things, likely by their peers, right? We'll go into this further, pardon me, in a moment, okay? Then we've got Rahu over in the 5th. Well, Rahu is going to kind of move them away from that need to be an authority about something by making them doubt what they think they know, right? It's just naturally going to do that. And when you've got Ketu and Ardra, in a previous lifetime, the individual was really focused, really able to have a depth of focus in regards to things, but maybe occasionally they were even blindsided then because Ketu's in Rahu's nakshatra, and Rahu's lord is in Capricorn, where it's debilitated. Jupiter's debilitated there, right? So maybe they were blind to things. Maybe even though they were an authority, they weren't really an authority. They just thought they were an authority. It's just one way of looking at it, okay? So let's look at the dignity of Ketu and Rahu's lords and see if we can understand how this begins to develop. So Ketu's in Gemini, and we've got Mercury. It's past its exaltation point, but it's still in its own house. And so that's a strong Mercury, right? So previous lifetime with Ketu, that would have been, pretty solid. We'll take a look at what that means here in a moment. When we look at Rahu, the story is much different, right? So we've got Rahu with Jupiter as its lord, and Jupiter's debilitated, right? So that means Rahu is going to be very difficult for the individual. When they're in Ketu Dasha, even though it'll be a little bit chaotic, the individual is going to recognize this as something that they were familiar with, right? It's going to be a little bit easier. No Ketu Dasha is ever easy, but it'll be a little easier than Rahu would. Okay, so that's just a quick way of assessing that. Then we need to look at what we were talking about, right? Which is the fact that Ketu's lord Mercury is in the 2nd from the Ascendant. So even though this individual had this way of looking at things, and even though they were seen as being an authority, it was a lot of responsibility for them. They were an idea person likely too, because we've got Mercury in the second house. Second house can be associated with ideas, and Mercury's in Chitra Nakshatra, and people with Chitra placements want to create something of lasting worth. So this person had a lot of really good ideas, and they were probably always getting a lot of feedback from the people in their lives that, wow, you know, that's a really good idea that you've got. But the fact that they were being seen as that was a lot of responsibility for them. The fact that they were able to creatively manifest their own destiny, it got hard to manage. And I've done a little look at this chart too, and looked at the placement of the 12th cusp, which is an exact degree. We're not just looking at the house, we're looking at a degree when we're looking at the cusps. And I looked at the Shasti Amsha deity that was associated with that. And that was Maya. And the idea there with Maya, as we know, is illusion. But there's also the connection with, you know, needing to juggle things, getting caught up in illusion, which would fit with Ketu and Ardra Nakshatra. Ardra can tend to bring focus in a certain area, but the person is missing something. It's almost like they're living in an illusion. And in a previous lifetime, they may have been living in an illusion of a belief system or a way of looking at things, and have been able to creatively manifest their own destiny in association with that. And it got a lot of feedback from their peers in terms of, you know, wow, you're really smart and you're coming up with all these really good ideas. Could have had the same thing from family as well, especially elder sibling, because the 11th would be elder siblings, and the second relates to family. It can also be through friends, peers, family, all of those factors. And they could have had a decent amount of income in relation to that because of the 11th and the second association. 11th being associated with gain, and second being associated with you know, wealth in general. And both of these are mercurial nakshatras, which could be, you know, business acumen, right? But they were an authority, and they were kind of stuck in this illusion about it, right? It's one way we can look at it. So then when they are in their Ketu dasha, Mercury is also in the 4th from Ketu. So that's going to bring, you know, very focused development during Ketu dasha. It's going to make them, you know, really look at perhaps some of the things they learned previously about fortune, about some of the things they learned previously about happiness, right? During their Ketu dasha. And the fact that they may even look at the fact that money may not buy happiness. It may give security, but it may not buy them the happiness that they're looking for. These are all things that can come to the surface during their Ketu dasha, right? So then let's look at Rahu, when the person's in their Rahu dasha. So this is going to be more stressful. Rahu's in Mula, and Mula tends to make an individual, if the Lord isn't disposed well, which the Lord is disposed well, right? And the individual probably learned a lot in a previous lifetime anyway. But because the Lord of Rahu is, the Lord of Mula, I should say, is Ketu, and Ketu has its Lord Mercury in decent dignity. Sorry, I shouldn't point down here because I haven't taught you the Logitati of Astas, right? Learn those on your own. They're really vast, and they're really good to learn. So look at the fact that Mercury is in its own house. So you can look at it through here, right? So Rahu's Lord, Nakshatra Lord, Ketu, is well dignified, right? So even though the individual may kind of push up against a brick wall, occasionally he has these little realizations, right? But he may not know what to do with them, because Jupiter is going to give that creative intelligence. And we've got a debilitated Jupiter. So it can either make it so he has this realization, but he doesn't know what to do with it, or can't do anything about it with Rahu, right? So again, Rahu is focusing on the fifth. What inspires me? What do I really believe? Aside from the confirmation I got by my intellectual thoughts in a previous lifetime, right? I've creatively manifested my own desires in a previous lifetime, but that was a lot of responsibility. Even though I was able to be, really focused and people saw me as an authority. Well, now I just kind of want to see what I really believe and what really inspires me. Well, because Jupiter is debilitated, that individual with a retrograde Jupiter can have a really hard time finding that. It's going to be hard for them to discover it. And they're going to keep looking and delving deeply as per Mula and really trying to get to the root of things, right? And still always feeling like they're coming up empty-handed or missing something, okay? Because of the missing the bigger picture, not being able to see the connections. Here we have Jupiter and Shravana. Sorry, I promised I wasn't going to do it, but here I am, I'm doing it, right? I can't help it. So then we can see that Jupiter is in the 6th from the Ascendant, from Leo, right? That's going to bring a lot of stress for the individual during their Rahu Dasha, right? It's going to make things really challenging. They're going to have a lot of conflict. They're not going to know what the nature of that conflict is about. They're not going to understand why they're not getting anywhere. They could even have a lot of debt in their life, as per the 6th house, right? Previous lifetime was having financial abundance. Well, this time they can have, a lot of debt in their life. And that debt is a huge responsibility for them because of Jupiter being in the 2nd from Rahu and being in the 6th from the Ascendant, right? Equally, while they're trying to find out what inspires them, it's a stressful journey to discover that. They don't know what they believe in, and they keep ending up coming up second, coming up empty-handed, I should say. And because Jupiter's in the 2nd from Rahu, that feels like a lot of responsibility. And in a previous lifetime where they may have had a lot of ideas, this lifetime, they don't have an idea. They don't, they're wanting to feel creatively inspired, but they don't have the ideas that they had previously, right? Because they've got a weak Jupiter that's debilitated. And so it makes that experience more difficult for them. Now, in one of the future videos, I'm going to hint at it now just to give you an idea. And I think we're going to stop there for this one. In one of the future videos, as we've kind of already seen, that there's an 11th house agenda and a 2nd house agenda, and there's a 5th house agenda and a 6th house agenda. Some of the things we might want to look at for this individual are their finance vargas, like the Chaturtamsha or the Hora chart. We might want to look at the Saptamsha. There's a 5th house matter, so there can be a child agenda there. And we might want to look at family, distant relatives, right? Because we have 2 things that are talking about family. And I forgot to discuss one of those points, didn't I? So let's discuss one more thing, and then we're going to stop here. So as Ketu has that 11th house agenda, its Lord is in the 4th. And it's in the 4th from Ketu, I should say. And it's in the 2nd from the Ascendant. So those 11th house matters of peers or creatively, being able to manifest one's desires and being an authority, that happened potentially through family, potentially through friends, right? We have 2nd and 4th both being activated. Both of those can indicate family. So there's a good chance that it happened through family. May have had an affluent family to help support one during that. Equally, it could have dealt with fortune. The 4th house is also a fortune-related house. That one's happiness with what one has. That's why it's considered fortune. And the 2nd, obviously being wealth. So Ketu's agenda, Ketu's 11th house agenda would play itself out through 2nd house factors, and equally play itself out through 4th house factors. You can take that a step further too. You can go, what is the Charakaraka for Mercury? Atmakaraka, right? So, basically, here we have that authority thing playing itself out, right? Ketu and Saturn, being an authority in a previous lifetime. And it played itself out through being an authority, having, you know, an affluent family, having a decent amount of finances, being able to creatively manifest one's desires, all those things. So Rahu, basically, the Rahu fifth house agenda is going to play itself out through potentially health-related factors or distant relatives, in contrast to closer knit family, right? It's going to play itself out through the more distant relatives. Whether one can stand being around one's distant relatives, how one's health is going to be. Potentially the health of one's child could be an issue with that too, because we've got the fifth and the sixth from the Ascendant, right? And it being one's own family that there could be issues with, right? Now, those of you who have this placement, don't, you know, start jumping to conclusions, because it doesn't necessarily mean that. There are so many other different factors we have to take into consideration, and we're just scraping the surface, albeit a very deep level of the surface, right? So the point being that Rahu's fifth house agenda of trying to find out what inspires one and what one believes in can again play itself out through family, because Jupiter's in the second from Rahu, and that's going to feel like a tremendous responsibility for the individual. They may have a child, and that child ends up bringing them a lot of stress, or there's a lot of debt because they have a child, right? All of these are just possible interpretations, and it can even be all of those things. And many times with Rahu and Ketu, it is every single one of those things, because they're such focal points for one's karma. They're quite literally just going to, if you're in Ketu, it's going to make you look at, you know, what you've developed and what you've done, but you can kind of feel stuck there, right? If it's in Rahu, it's going to make you see what you need to develop. But if the Lord of Rahu is not doing well, it's going to make it hard for you to feel like you're getting anywhere with it, right? So just trying to give you a couple of examples of this. Next video, I think we're just going to stay dedicated to doing a couple more examples on these points, just so we can drive these points home. If you'd like for me to look at Rahu and Ketu in your own chart, please do feel free to visit my website. You can schedule a consultation with me, www.authenticastrology.com. You can look for the astrological services link, or if you just look in the bottom corner over there, there's a link to my astrological services page. Thanks a lot. Bye now.